be chairing the session on incentives and performance today. We're going to have three presentations. We're going to take 15 minutes to present, followed by 5 minutes of comments from a discussant, and then we'll open the floor to you for Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to start the session and invite Bakhtawar to start his presentation.
Hi everyone. So my name is Bakhtawar. For those of you who don't know me, I am a PhD candidate at the Aix-Marseille School of Economics in France, and today I will be presenting my job market paper, which is titled "Lawfare in Action," and I will give you evidence from anti-corruption trials in Pakistan. So the motivation for this paper is pretty straightforward. Why should we care for an independent judiciary? Why have an independent judiciary? There are many reasons, but one important reason is that judiciary is strongly correlated with economic development. And it's not only a phenomena in some countries, but it is a phenomena across the world. And the more the judiciary is independent, we observe in many countries that the GDP per capita seems to be higher. But why is GDP per capita linked with uh, independence of judiciary? Judiciary protects our economic rights as well as our political rights. So it is unsurprising that the independence of judiciary is linked with economic growth. And however, there is one thing that is usually not studied enough for judiciary is how can judiciary be weaponized to persecute your political opponents or for political repression. So to the audience here, this might be straightforward that judiciary can be manipulated to target politicians, but this threat of weaponizing the judiciary is a global phenomena. Let me give you a couple of examples for this. If you remember, in November 2017, Mohammed bin Salman, who is now the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, he captured and imprisoned many other prominent Saudi princes. And it was not done for account. Well, it is said it was done for accountability, but many believe that it was to quash the competition to the Saudi crown. And if we look you can say that in Saudi Arabia it's an autocracy. But if you look at a democracy, a consolidated democracy, in 2016 when Trump ran for his presidential campaign, uh, he ran on the slogan. One of the slogan was "Lock her up." So he was going to lock Hillary Clinton up when he was going to come to office. And then in the Biden administration, around 100 cases were filed against Trump. And many commentators, including Donald Trump himself, says, I don't want to copy him, but he says that it is weaponization of the justice system against him. Now, what do I do in this paper? So I ask three questions. The first question is, does weaponization of justice, is it an isolated incident, or does it reflect a systematic form of political strategy employed by the governments? And the second question I ask is weaponization of justice only happening in an autocratic setting, or does it also happen in a democratic setting? And finally, I ask the question that when your judiciary is engaged in uh, lawfare or targeting politicians, what happens to the legitimate corruption cases in the society? So, very quick background. I am going to study the NAB courts in Pakistan. And if for anyone who's unaware, these NAB courts were established by General Pervez Musharraf. And the idea was to persecute corruption. However, we learned that they are more susceptible for political misuse later on. And Pakistan has a long history of lawfare, for example, abdo, which was used to disqualify political opponents back in the 60s. So Pakistan provides me with an ideal context to study this and to test this empirically. So the empirical strategy, let me just quickly tell you that, I'm going to be looking at the NAB corruption cases, but I just cannot simply look at these corruption cases. It's not that straightforward. If I compare corruption convictions of NAB courts, and I see like people who are convicted and people who are not convicted, so people who are convicted just might be more corrupt to begin with, right? So there is a fundamental identification challenge here. So we cannot simply compare corruption convictions of candidates. So I'm going to look at, I'm going to use the election data and look at people who win and people who lose the election. So we cannot compare corruption cases of candidates who win the election versus candidates who lose the election. Uh, the idea is that the people who win the election might already be more corrupt to begin with, and they might be using their corruption money or their corruption practices to actually win the election. So comparing them would not work out. So to speak to this challenge, to address this challenge, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a regression discontinuity design, and I'm going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to do is I'm only going to look at the cases that are filed before the outcome of the election, so that when the election, when the case filing behavior changes uh, after the election, the government might change its case filing behavior. That does not affect the results. So I'm going to use, I'm going to only look at cases that were filed before the election. And the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the marginal winners and marginal losers in a regression discontinuity design. And my main identification assumption here will be that uh, all the observed and unobserved characteristics, except for their political affiliation, are same for these marginal winners and marginal losers. So what I'm looking at is people who win the election at 49.9% versus 50.01%. And the equation that I'm going to use is uh, developed by Colonico, Contino, and Farrell. Uh, and I'm going to use a local linear regression to measure the coefficient, and I'm going to use a local quadratic regression to for bias correction, and I'm going to use a triangular kernel which gives more weights to elections that are closer. So just let me quickly dive into the results. So I asked three questions in the beginning. So the first question was, is weaponization of the justice system an isolated event, or does it look like a legitimate political strategy? And I find evidence that yes, this seems to be a legitimate political strategy, and I see that people. So I'm only looking at opposition politicians here. So the losers are opposition and the winners are opposition. So who are my opposition politicians? So opposition politicians are politicians whose party lost the national election, but they win their local seat. So their party lost. They are not part of the coalition that makes the government, but they win their local seat. So these are the people who win their local seat versus lose their local seats. And when I look at the conviction probability for a corruption, for a corruption conviction, I look that for marginal winners. So if you marginally win the election, the probability of you being convicted for an existing corruption case skyrockets. And the more interesting outcome for, well, this is kind of straightforward for us, but the more interesting outcome for me was that, okay, here we see that politicians, opposition politicians, are being targeted for corruption charges. However, I find an opposite effect when we look at the affiliates. So when we look at the affiliates of the government or the government, all the parties that are affiliated with the government or are part of making the government, what I observe is that there is a systematic reduction. So it's not only that you're targeting your opposition politicians, but you kind of have a halo effect, or you are protecting your own. So you're targeting on one hand, but you're protecting your affiliates on the other. The second question I asked in this paper, is this confined to only an autocratic setting, or does can this also happen in a democracy? So studying Pakistan actually gives us this flexibility to study autocracy and democracy, and I find that this effect remains true in the 2002 election, when General Pervez Musharraf was in power, and when Pakistan had transitioned to a democracy in 2008, the effect still holds. So the effect size does reduce from when moving from an autocratic setting to a democratic setting, but the effect still holds. Similarly, the effect is also true for protection of your political affiliates. I find that in both 2002 elections, under an autocratic setting, there is a halo effect protecting your affiliates, and in 2008, there is still a halo effect. And the third thing I asked in this paper was, what happens to the actual corruption cases when your judiciary is engaged in lawfare, or when it is engaged in targeting politicians? So what I find is, here I look at the districts of oppositions, and I look at the cases of uh, opposition politicians who marginally win the election and marginally lost the election. So here I'm looking at the districts. So what I observe is, when I look at the districts of marginal winners, what I see is that there is a reduction, or there is a lower probability of non-political corruption charges being prosecuted. So what I observe is that the corruption probability is reducing, or it is lower in opposition. So when your judiciary is engaged in targeting political opponents, what I observe is there is a reduction in non political or civil servants or bureaucratic corruption cases. And this is not only true at the extensive margin, but I also look at it at the intensive margin. So as the caseload of the district increases, the corruption probability of those corruption probability of non-political cases reduce. So, in conclusion, I present you evidence which is that lawfare is not confined to some anecdotes, which is only a few cases, but it represents a systematic distortion of judicial procedures for political gain. And I present evidence which shows that there is a disproportionate effect of targeting opposition politicians. And finally, weaponization of the justice displaces legitimate corruption cases, and there is a crowd out. And for policy implication, my results underscore the critical role of institutional safeguards in preventing the misuse of the justice system. Thank you very much. Questions, I think, would be. Thank you.
So thank you for your presentation. We'll now have comments from Eamon. We'll take 5 minutes to have some comments from the discussant, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers. Eamon, you have a presentation? Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me for a third year in a row, and thanks for the opportunity to read this really nice paper. I think anecdotally, all of us are aware of the fact that building a corruption crusade and taking it too far can have unintended negative consequences. But this, I think, is one of the first papers to present us with empirical evidence on that phenomenon. So in that sense, I think it's a really new and exciting question, and the evidence is really great. I had an older version of the paper, so some of the things that I'm going to suggest have clearly already been implemented. So I think maybe we'll go through things faster. My preferred reading of the paper was that we all know that corruption is detrimental to economic growth. And as a result, dedicated corruption cleaning efforts can be very helpful for economic growth, but can also have unintended consequences because these types of efforts, by their nature, are more susceptible to capture by politicians. And in Pakistan's case, Bakhtawar's paper shows that anti-corruption campaigns are used by incumbents to punish opposition leaders for winning elections. So I think in this context, what I would suggest is that it would be helpful to make the case that it's ambiguous whether anti-corruption campaigns can be good or not. Like there is a trade-off, and I feel like the paper focuses primarily on some of the negative impacts, but I think I don't know if there's evidence from the literature that talks about how anti-corruption campaigns can have some positive effects. They weren't really cited. The examples that were cited were more China, Saudi Arabia, using this very much to go after political opponents. So either citing from the literature, but also I think within Pakistan, there's probably some benefit of having specialized courts that deal with corruption cases in freeing up resources in more traditional courts to do the more day-to-day business. And like maybe just even nodding at that trade-off, I think makes for a more complicated and interesting story than just asking the question about is politicization of anti-corruption efforts bad? Because the answer is obviously yes, and I think it makes for a more interesting paper if these are more ambiguous things with like trade-offs that are set up in that way. I think Bakhtawar has done this a lot more in the presentation than the version that I had, which is this idea that context in this case really matters because NAB is a very, very unique institutional setup. And so what we want to learn as an audience from this setup is what can we extrapolate, like what can we learn more broadly? And I think you've done a lot more of that by asking the question, is this an isolated incident or is this something that just sort of repeatedly happens? But I think going even beyond that to talk about what makes NAB special. For example, is it the promotion structure, appointment structure of judges? Is it the appeal system? What is it about this institution that then also exists in other institutions around the world? And therefore, what we see happening in terms of the political capture of NAB is something that'll happen elsewhere as well. And again, I think that, so I was going to suggest like, comparing it with Donald Trump in the US and so on, and thinking about whether authoritarianism of the state itself matter or not. And you've clearly done that or going in that direction. So I think that's really great. But in this case, I think context really matters. I'll say quickly on identification that it's obviously I think we're all used to accepting that marginal winners and losers are quite comparable. But another thing that being from Pakistan, when someone says a very close election, I would worry about is that it was probably also a very special election. It was close and rigged in favor of one candidate. And then a person who successfully rigs an election might be quite different from his opponent or her opponent who wasn't able to. And so I would think a little bit about what a close election in this context means, and perhaps just showing us a balanced table of the characteristics of winners and losers being similar is all that will help. I'll skip this. I think you've already done this, but the main thing, I think the analysis I find compelling is comparing marginal opposition winners to marginal opposition losers rather than marginal opposition winners to incumbent losers, which is the latter is what I saw in the paper, but I think you're pivoting more towards the former. But within this context, I would think a little bit about, is the incumbent government targeting the political party as a whole, and certain prominent people within the political party would have been targeted regardless of whether they won or lost. They're just the prominent people. And so I think some of your analysis on marginal opposition winners and losers can help tell us that, is it a penalty for winning an election or is it just a penalty for being a prominent person in the opposition party? And the effects that you document are huge, like 40 percentage point increase is large, and that's maybe a combination of the party being targeted and any individual who wins being targeted. And I think you can perhaps sort of isolate the individual impact as well as the political party impact. The final, I think people obviously try and tell lots of alternative stories. I don't believe this story, but I think you want to perhaps rule out these types of stories, which is that people who win elections probably commit more corruption because they're shielded by the office. And so to what extent are opposition winners just committing more corruption? I think again, in the version that I read, the fact that you're using pre-election cases, I didn't quite realize that, but I think that already helps get at some of this. One thing that I saw in this table, so this is a table that shows the number of cases that are filed against incumbents and affiliates. And in column 2, I think you argue that, look, the effect is insignificant. But what worries me about that effect is, well, the sample size is really small and the effect is large. And so I would think a little bit about what this coefficient is telling us. Is it that the opposition is now retaliating against the incumbent winners by filing more frivolous cases against them? I mean, yeah, I would take this coefficient a bit more seriously. And I think this is my final comment, which is that I really like that the paper shows us what are now the unintended effects of targeting politicians beyond just the politicians themselves and this crowding out effect, especially for judges who are more congested. I would compare these effects to conviction of politicians, because it might just be that judges who are busier are neither convicting politicians nor bureaucrats as much as judges who have more time. Because if I'm very busy, I'd rather just do the safe thing and acquit people and move on. So I think it's important to see if this is differential between bureaucrats and politicians. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll email you the rest of the comments. Thanks.
Thanks, Eamon. So we have about 6 minutes for Q&A from the audience. We'll take 3 questions and come back to the presenter, and then perhaps we can do another round as well. So questions from the audience.
Thanks, Bakhtawar. Very interesting. I was actually also, in the spirit of the comments, trying to think about, okay, how can we take this further? On the economic side, because politicians represent districts, is there a way to think about there are economic consequences of having these cases filed against you? Because clearly there's an increased so if I buy your story and there's an increased probability of conviction, does that mean you have less time to spend on your district's issues? Obviously, getting district level data on economic outcomes is not very easy, but one thing that you could do, which has been done in the past, is to look at, say, night lights data, which is a proxy for economic activity at the district level, or maybe the household survey or the labor force participation survey. You don't even need a panel structure for that, right? Because those you would have district level data. So that's just one suggestion for taking it forward. Thanks.
Any other questions? You want to respond, and then we can go back to
So, hello, yeah, this one. So thank you, Eamon. I think your comments were really useful and very insightful, and I agree that I should consider that these are special courts, and yeah, and to consider what you suggested about election fraud. So in my study, what I'm using is like 2002 and 2008 election, and well, election day rigging is a more recent phenomena, but I do a McCready test in the paper, and I actually show that this is not a problem for us, and especially because I'm looking at marginal winners and marginal losers, and if so the main identification assumption is that if one politician who is winning at 49.9% versus 50.01, they are equally likely to be able to do this election fraud. And the other thing is that some prominent people are targeted. Yes, of course, they are. This might be true, and it is a good suggestion that we should try to disentangle this effect. But my setting kind of allows me to just look at these election winners and how this can be addressed. And about judges being busier, I'm still trying to collect the data of all the judges that actually adjudicated these cases. So once I have that, I should be able to see their caseload. And yeah, and thank you, Faizan, for your comment. I think that is very important that we should consider the economic consequences and what is the loss For example, all the money that the government is spending to target opposition politicians, you could build actually, I don't know, two bridges or a hospital or whatever, right? So yes, I think that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions? We have about a minute and a half to 2 minutes. Yes, Saad.
Thank you. Can you say something about what happens to these opposition districts in terms of the politician supply in the longer run, since many, you now have more than a decade after your study period?
Thank you for this very interesting comment. I haven't looked at if the same politicians run for the election over time in those same districts. But yeah, that is something that I should definitely look at.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions and for the presentation. We can now move on to the next paper. So Eamon, if I can please invite you to take the stage.
Okay, thanks for bearing with me a bit longer. I'm going to talk about this new project, which is an ongoing experiment called Screening Women Out, experimenting with salary disclosure in job ads. So I don't think I have to convince this room very much that women's employment and labor market outcomes really crucially shape economic growth, and yet there are large gender barriers in labor markets that persist globally. A lot of the effort to target this problem has been on getting women to increase their total levels of job search, employment, wages, things like that. Some policies and research has gone further, thinking about the fact that just getting women to search more or accept more job offers isn't going to do the trick, because sometimes women just segregate in lower paying occupations. So maybe we need to think about changing the type of work that women do. In the paper today, I'm going to encourage us to think not just about the type of work women do, but also where women do this work. The idea being that firms are quite different from one another, and some firms will pay you a higher premium despite you being observationally a similar worker doing a similar job. And if there are firms that are just higher paying than other firms in the market, but women face barriers to accessing those firms through their applications or bargaining for the pay surplus that is available at those firms, then just the fact that there is heterogeneity in how much firms pay for similar jobs will result in gender gaps in employment and wages. The specific type of search friction that I'm going to talk about today is the absence of salary information in job ads. So we have a big literature that says workers really pay attention to job ads and salary information within them to decide where to apply and how much to bargain for. And downstream, the advertised salaries as a result determine how much workers actually end up getting paid. Nonetheless, salary information is widely missing around the world in job ads. So like 6 of these countries, for example, more than 80% of the job ads do not state any salary information. And this can be particularly costly for women if we think that women have a particular tendency to avoid ambiguous situations, like they don't want to enter a bargaining process without knowing something about the bargaining space, or if we think that they're cut off from professional networks that might allow them to infer the hidden curriculum of wages, that might enable them to read non-wage information and extract wage signals from it. So in this paper, I'm going to consider whether the absence of salary information in equilibrium results in some misallocation of job search by women prevents them from reaching and targeting their efforts at these high-paying, good jobs. I'm going to do this by running an experiment on Pakistan's largest online job search platform. This experiment has now been running for about 4 months. It covers more than 14,000 jobs, 6,000 firms across the spectrum of industries and occupations that you can think of. I'll look at the impact of these types of reforms, like making salary transparent in job ads, on how firms advertise wages in job ads, how candidates redirect their search, and ultimately at the match quality given the application pools that I observe. So just for some context, the job platform that I'm working with is bigger than the next 5 platforms combined. One of its unique features is that when employers are uploading job ads, they have to say the minimum and maximum salary of the ad. They have to report that to the platform, but they may optionally hide it from the job seekers. And so, and there's various reasons why they have incentives to report truthful ranges to the platform. They eventually use some algorithms, some matching functions to filter out irrelevant candidates when they do this. So using this data, using the fact that I always observe salaries, even when they're invisible to the workers, I'll document 3 key facts that motivated the experiment that I'm running. The first is that when I look at jobs that are otherwise very similar in all the attributes that you can imagine, the jobs that hide salary are higher paying. And that was a surprise to me because so this is the minimum, the midpoint, and the maximum of the salary range that is advertised in job ads. I had always imagined that if you're paying well, you would want to advertise that to attract talent towards your firm, but it's the opposite. If you're paying well for a certain job type, you're more likely to hide that fact. And then for a number of job characteristics that I can control for, I try and see what really drives the hiding behavior of firms. And I find that the job characteristics all put together explain at most 13% of variation in whether or not you're going to hide the salary. But firm characteristics explain over 53% of the variation in the hiding decision. So it's really like a firm level decision about whether or not they're going to reveal the salary. And so that led me to think about what types of firms hide salary. And it's clear that it's on a number of different measures, just bigger firms, just better paying firms that hide salary. They have more employees, they have a higher market share of jobs, they have a higher market share of applications. So that led me to just do a firm survey and ask firms, you have good salaries, why are you hiding them? And what the firms told me is that we think if we reveal the salary, the quantity of applications that we get will increase, but the quality will worsen. And this really hints at a screening concern of sorts. The idea being that around the world, low-income countries, as they grow, the supply of human capital is increasing. Having more choice over workers is good for firms so long as their ability to screen grows in parallel. But what's happening is that while workers have a lot of education and a lot of experience, it's hard to know what is the quality of that education and experience, especially in countries like Pakistan, where, again, there's a lot of degrees afloat, but they're quite heterogeneous in type. So on the platform as well, 89% of the applicants for an average job meet its education requirements, 76% meet its experience requirements. So on paper, everyone's a good worker, but then to really figure out whether they're a good fit for your firm, you have to invest a lot more time in interviewing them and getting to know them, which is quite costly for firms. And then job platforms, where a lot of these jobs are now increasingly moving, make this problem even worse because they're designed to make it easy for workers to apply quickly, which means workers can send around a lot of irrelevant applications. So it takes, on average, just 2 minutes for the typical worker to send an application to any job on this portal. And the average job gets about 83 applications. So there's a big literature that talks about how, especially firms in countries like Pakistan, hire within the family. That's also because they want to avoid the risk of adverse selection, they want to avoid screening. And in this paper, I'm documenting a new margin of adjustment, which is that firms hide the salary, thinking, if you know you're the right type, you'll apply anyway. And if you are applying just because the salary is high, this will deter you from applying. So it's kind of like this self-screening mechanism where they're passing the screening costs onto the worker and saying, you'll just know optimally if this is the right job for you without us explicitly telling you the salary of the job. And that might work in general, but what I'm going to argue in this paper is it works actually quite well for deterring low ability men, but at the same time, it screens out high ability women. So here I'm showing you the relationship between applications by men and women and salary. And I think what's reassuring to me is while there's a lot of literature that says women don't care about salaries, here you can see quite clearly women will direct more applications towards higher paying jobs so long as a salary is visible. But when the salary is hidden, men still have some positive ability to read a job ad and figure out that it's a good job, whereas women, for some reason, lose the ability to direct search at higher paying jobs. And so this motivated me to conduct an experiment in which the control jobs have a choice over whether or not they're going to reveal the salary. And the treated jobs are told, sorry, your job has been randomly selected to reveal the salary, so whatever you're going to put in these 2 boxes is going to be shown to the workers. And based on this experiment, just trust me that there's a first stage. Based on this experiment, I look at downstream how firms adjust their wage setting behavior, how workers adjust their search. Now, in terms of wages, two things can happen. Now that firms' competitors are also posting salaries, you're more directly competing with competitors to attract workers. This could increase market salaries. On the other hand, now that everyone's reporting salaries, you can tacitly collude to just agree to lowball all the workers. So that's why there are a lot of laws in the US that prevent employers from talking to each other about how much they're going to pay their employees. And then in terms of the range, firms who really want to avoid communicating any information about salary may just widen the range and say nothing really in terms of what they're actually going to pay. What I find is that nothing happens to the maximum advertised salary. The minimum advertised salary goes up by 3%, and as a result, the range actually gets more compact. I'm happy to discuss why I think this makes a lot of sense given what firms told me in the survey. So I take this mostly to mean that wages don't really change that much. And then I turn to the supply and think about how workers respond. Workers shouldn't respond if they already knew the salary even when they were hidden, or if they don't really care about salary when deciding where to apply. But I see that there's a 50% increase in applications to jobs that were in my treatment group or that were induced to reveal the salary. And that this increase is predominantly coming from large firms. Workers are sort of redirecting search. There's more search in general, but there's more search being targeted at large firms. This is something that I had expected to see in pre-registered for two reasons. One, when workers have valuable information about salaries, the impact should be biggest on the ads where salaries were previously hard to figure out and are now revealed to be quite high. Because if you already knew the salaries, you would already be applying more to those jobs. Or if you now have learned the salaries, but they're lower than other jobs, you would stop applying to them. And what happens with large firms is they hide the salaries more. So it's harder to know what their salaries are. And my treatment induces them to reveal. So their salaries were previously hard to learn. And they're now revealed to pay better because they just pay more than smaller firms hiring for the same roles. So even in the control group, they pay more across the range and they have a more compact range. Treatment doesn't affect their salaries at all. The increase that we were seeing of 3% was all coming from small firms. And so because they pay more, they attract more workers. The second heterogeneity that it pre-registered is impact should be largest on women. And that's indeed what I see. So in the control group, as I showed you in the scatter plot, men already have some ability to send more applications to large firms even when the salaries are not visible, and women less so. But when the salaries are revealed, both men and women target the larger firms more, but the treatment effect on women is much larger. It's about 115%. And it completely closes the gender gap that I was showing you in the scatter plots, in that now women are more responsive than men, as they were in the scatter plots, to salary information. So it seems like a full information story that just providing them information fixed. This leads me to think now about whether firms are right that the quality of the applicants that we're getting is worse. And what I see is that it's true that on a number of different margins, skills, experience, education, the share that meet the requirements of the job has gone down a little bit, especially on skills, you can see that. The other story is also true, which is that already on paper, pretty much everyone meets at least the experience and education requirements. So you're not really, and these are characteristics that are easier to filter out. So I don't really think this is a huge cost, but clearly large firms have this 3 percentage point decline in the likelihood that the workers meet the skills requirements. So I think a little bit, so that's the average. But you're not going to hire the average applicant. You care more about who's the best applicant in your pool. So I think a little bit about whether disclosing salary information allows you to attract the stars from the labor market. And so I look at the full sample of workers on this platform, which is about 2 million, and I look at the top percentile of a number of different characteristics that determine ability, such as education, expected salary, years of experience, whether they've ever managed a team. And what you can see for men is that the control group already has a very high likelihood that a high ability man will be in their applicant pool. But the control group has only about a 50% likelihood that a high ability woman will apply. So men just throw around applications and apply everywhere. So if I'm an employer, I wouldn't worry that if I hide the salary, I'm going to lose the top talent because men apply everywhere. But what I'm not thinking about is that high ability women are, for some reason, way more selective and are not applying everywhere. And what treatment does is it increases by 9 to 10 percentage points the likelihood that they will now start applying to my job once I reveal the salary information to them. The cost is that they have to tolerate some low ability candidates because it also increases the likelihood a little bit that low ability men and women apply. So there's this trade-off, and I think for jobs that really reward talent, this matters, but for jobs I think that high ability men and women are close substitutes, maybe they're not willing to tolerate the cost of having some low ability people in their pool. So let me conclude by saying that wage transparency laws are increasingly popular around the world. For example, in the US, in just the past 2 years, the number of states that have made it mandatory for firms to advertise their salaries in ads has gone from 0 to 18. So it's really important to think about the impacts of these types of reforms, factoring in that these reforms can have some perverse, unintended effects on firms. And if firms, for example, are worried that now their applicant quality is going to go down, they might actually reduce the wages or implement other types of ordeals that make things worse. But at the same time, it's important to think about the fact that firms have devised this self-screening strategy with only men in mind. They're not accounting for the fact that for some reason, high ability women search differently. They want more certainty when they're applying. So the next step on this project is going to be doing a vignette experiment with women to try and understand when they read a job ad without salary information, what happens? How do they decide whether they're going to apply to it or not? And get at some of the mechanisms and develop some theory and then just write the paper. So, okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Eamon. I'm going to be quick with my comments so we can open the floor for Q&A. Can everyone hear me, by the way? I'm not sure if this mic is working. Okay, great. So thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed reading your abstract. So just to quickly, I mean, I'm not going to take too long summarizing, but we looked at, this paper looked at non-disclosure by salary firms, how this affects the applicant pool, both quantity and quality, and whether this disproportionately affects women. So I'm going to mention 3 things that I really liked about the paper, and then some comments and questions. I'll restrict myself to 3. So the first thing is, I think the topic I thought was really interesting. The recent kind of studies that we've seen on, why gaps in gender employment continue to persist, look at structural barriers at the women's side, at the side of the labor market. And I actually never thought that salary non-disclosure could affect this as well. So I thought that angle was new, it was unique. And then this point about firm heterogeneity, I thought it was really interesting. And there's so much more that you could look into that. And I think you mentioned some of those things. So I thought the kind of the topic is unique and it was really fresh. The second thing, which I'm sure everyone in the audience also appreciated, is the rich data that you're working with. I think it's really the data and the descriptives that you show in the paper, they were really compelling. And I thought what you did with presenting the stylized facts on non-disclosure of salary were really interesting. When you read the title, you're like, okay, how big is this problem? Should I care about this? And I think the descriptives that you presented do a really good job of explaining who's hiding salary, why is heterogeneity in firms important there, and why are firms hiding in the first place. So I think that basically worked really well. I really enjoyed reading that, and I also think that sets you up for the experiment really well. So I think that part kind of flows really well. And the third thing that I also really liked about your paper is how simple and clean your experiment is. So that's always really nice to read, and it makes the paper for an easy and fun read. In terms of the comments, so I think one thing you've already mentioned in your conclusion, but I think kind of the main point is that women are searching differently from men, and there's something about the hidden salary. And I think as I was reading, I was like, okay, why is this happening? And is it just the salary, or is it some other hidden feature that the women kind of infer when they don't see a salary? There's certain feature about a firm that hides a salary, and I don't want to go there. And maybe it's something about kind of, maybe that's very gendered, right? That a firm that's hiding a salary, maybe it's in a certain location, maybe it doesn't have certain, I don't know what it is, but I thought that's something that you could dig more into. And what I wanted to suggest suggest was that in your upcoming, since you said the project is ongoing, you could reveal some of those characteristics. I don't know, maybe you've run some interviews with these women. What do they think when they don't see a salary? And if you could make some of those things visible in your experiment and see what happens, that would be super interesting. Because if the main concern is that there's a youth screening cost that we're going to impose, then can we still do away with not reveal, even though maybe we should, but it would be more basically nice to dig into this. The second thing that it got a little bit clearer now, but I was asking myself, how big is this trade-off? So we're getting high ability and in table 3 in your abstract, you show basically the point estimates are larger for high ability women. For low ability women, they're a little bit stronger. I don't know if they were significantly different, but I was thinking, well, how big is this trade-off? Should I care about this? And is this one-to-one? Like, are we getting enough high ability women and also kind of losing, basically getting low ability women as well? So I was wondering whether this trade-off is one-to-one and whether you could do this a little bit more cleanly. So you look at a bunch of characteristics, right? I don't know if that can work, but could you think of maybe one simple ability index and kind of show this in a little bit, clearer way? I think that would really help. But the other thing that occurred to me was also that even if there is a trade-off, how important is this? Because ultimately, large firms right now that are revealing salary are getting more high ability women and men. Are they becoming more efficient with screening over time? And if that's the case, what are the implications for what you're seeing for your workforce composition? So ultimately, if you're getting more high ability and low ability women as well, but firms are becoming more efficient with screening, then are we going to end up with a workforce composition that has more high ability women? And it's getting those high ability women into the labor force that wasn't the case earlier. That's perhaps something for your theoretical framework, but this is something to think about. Like, what are the implications for workforce composition? Because we're looking at the applicant pool here. Two quick things. How do we benchmark these effects? Some of these look really large. How do we compare this with other information interventions that support women's search? The effects seem really large, but I was just wondering, how does this compare? I'll stop here. Just a few more things that we can discuss offline. I would like to open the floor for Q&A. So we have about 10 minutes. So yes, please, let's take 3 questions and then come back to.
Thank you, Ayman. Very interesting work. It's just a thought. Maybe you already thought about it. I was thinking that how do you, in your results, because we know from the literature that women tend to undervalue their skills or they have lower salary expectations and such. So, in your results, how do you separate the effect of your treatment from the deterrence caused by the fact that women felt underconfident once that information was revealed, and now they suddenly feel that, oh, the salary of this job that this job is going to give is so high that maybe my chances of getting hired here are very low. It's just the thought. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, Ayman, thank you. Really interesting study. A couple of points were in my mind. One was, do you have any data, because you surveyed firms as well, that how much is the difference between actual wage that is paid and that is advertised? Because I think this story is built on that if firm is committing at the time of advertisement that I'll pay this salary, then firm is ending up paying that, which might not be true in our setup, at least. For example, if you visit any exporting firm, the salary that they will tell you by chance always happens to be the minimum wage in that province. So I will be really interested to see that. The second thing is, we do have this like high ability women kind of applying more, but do you have any outcomes on that? That do they also end up getting the jobs, or it's just because the way we measure the ability?
Question at the back. I think we have time for 2 rounds. One question by the lady there, and then. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Eamon. Really interesting presentation and a really great paper. I think I guess the burning question I had was, in some sense, to me, this sounds a bit like a bias, perhaps, that we're seeing these gender differences. And from a sort of purely behavioral standpoint, I mean, we know from other work that once you make people aware of biases, you can potentially overcome these things. So while I think that that's an interesting area of next steps, is to try and document what the economic preferences are that are potentially leading that, and there's some work on gender differences in Pakistan, which doesn't fall in line with work from Western countries, so it's a little bit of a different context. But I also think that considering something a little bit down the line about awareness or making informing people that a bias exists can potentially help overcome these gender differences. But that's something for a little bit more long term. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. I have a lot to respond to. Let me start with Zahra's comments. I think one of the questions that you asked was how big really is this trade-off that you get more high ability women, but then the cost that you pay is you also get some low ability men and women. Yeah, so I think that this is a difficult question to answer, and this is probably where the GE search and matching literature can really help. So I'm like developing a theoretical framework. But I think the answer is going to be really heterogeneous by job type. So, for example, if you're an academic university trying to attract top talent, and I tell you that there's something about your ad that is reducing by 20% the likelihood that the best woman in the market applies, you're probably going to care a lot more about that than jobs where men and women, high and low ability, are like close substitutes, and you just care about finding a person quickly and not investing a lot of resources in screening. So there's that. Then there's also evidence that, especially in countries where gender barriers are really high, the only types of women who make it in the labor market are very positively selected. So the high ability women might actually be better than the high ability men. And so like these types of trade-offs as a result like really depend on the context and the job. But I think that it's possible the firms are overestimating the costs because the low ability people are the easiest to screen out. So that's, yeah. But I think one problem is now men are also applying more. And so women are these needles in a haystack, and the haystack grows as a result of my experiment. So probably even finding the high ability women who now are applying, but they're still small in absolute numbers. It's possible that I made the problem a little bit worse, and that's something I worry about. I can absolutely do an index of ability. So you'd ask this question about whether firms get more efficient with screening over time. That's probably something that I can look at perhaps within my experiment. It'll be running for about 6 months. I think someone in the audience asked me, one of the negative consequences of revealing salary is that women will self-select out of high salary jobs. That was my concern as well. But I think from my results, what we see, interestingly, is that men apply everywhere. Low ability women also apply everywhere. It's really just the very top of the labor market, like the most positively selected women who are very selective about where they apply. So I'm not seeing this unintended effect that now that you see the high salaries, you self-select out. The opposite was happening. High ability women were self-selecting out of jobs that were in fact high paying but weren't revealing the salaries. So I think we're good on that front. There's finally some good news. Okay, so you've asked the two questions that I dislike the most because those are the ones that I have no answers to, basically. Those are the hardest questions in this context. So I'm working with a platform where firms look for workers. Once they get in touch with the workers, they disappear off of the platform. So I have limited ability to follow them all the way to hiring and see what are the salaries in the contract. Having said that, I've just scraped LinkedIn data. So of the workers who were exposed to my platform. So if they change jobs, I now have a way of answering your question, which is a question that I get very often. I'll be able to now know if I've moved hiring outcomes. But let me say one thing that I think is quite crucial, which is you can't hire a woman who's not applying. And so the fact that they weren't even in the applicant pool to begin with and now are going to be, hopefully makes a difference. In terms of the relationship between advertised salaries and hired salaries, that because of my data limitations, I'm not able to speak to cleanly, but there are lots of good papers that use employer-employee match data and are able to compare wages of employers and employees relative to the advertisements and show that this is a very strong relationship. And that's also what firms tell me in this survey, which is that the reason we're hesitant to advertise is once we say we're willing to pay up to this maximum, workers are going to come in with an expectation. They're going to anchor to that max and ask us for that. So that's why they're hesitant to advertise. So I think the relationship is quite strong. Otherwise, if this was cheap, they would just advertise. There has to be a cost of advertising their higher salaries that's deterring them from doing that. So, but yeah, these are really important questions, and I need to figure out how to get at them better. And I think the LinkedIn data is probably going to get me part of the way there. And then I think a question at the back about bias. So I think that's one, there's lots of reasons why women may not be applying. It might be that they don't have access to networks that will just tell them the salary. It might be the opportunity cost of their time is higher. So they're not going to waste their time interviewing for a job where they don't know what the returns are going to be. Or it could be something more simple, which is that like me, they think, well, if you have a good salary, you would have just put it in the ad. And so they're uninformed about that, whereas men know more. I think if this is the case, then biases are easiest to correct, right? Like the intra-household bargaining stuff, like there's a higher opportunity cost to their time, like that's harder. And so it would be nice if that's the story. And so I can find out through my work experiment, but there's a lot of emphasis on wage transparency laws being a silver bullet. I think this work and there's other work that shows that they don't resolve all of the market frictions. So if it's a biased story, maybe the solution is just to tell women to apply more broadly.
So I think we've unfortunately run out of time, so we can take the rest of the questions to the coffee break. Okay, just going to. For frontline workers, as well as middle managers. And this is in the context of the Agricultural Extension Department in Punjab, Pakistan. This is joint work with Garance Jenico and Ghazala Mansouri. So I'm going to jump right in. So the challenge of designing incentive systems, it's something that's central to bureaucracies and organizational economics, but it is challenging. And the reason why it's challenging is because services are typically delivered through hierarchical systems. And we have middle managers who are also making important inputs into frontline service delivery. So there's a question of how do we think about incentivizing frontline workers, but at the same time incentivizing middle managers so they make their complementary inputs into frontline service delivery. This is also challenging because public sector jobs will have observable, easy to measure and incentivize dimensions, but at the same time, they'll have some dimensions that are difficult to measure and incentivize. So for example, public school teachers, we know it's easy to measure and incentivize whether they're coming to a classroom, which is attendance, but it's much more difficult to measure the quality of their teaching and to incentivize against them. At the same time, middle managers, they typically hold private information about how these agents, the quality of services that these agents are delivering. So again, if we go with the example of public school teachers, a head teacher will typically know whether this teacher is teaching well or not. So there's this question of how do you leverage that? So in this context, the question or the puzzle that we're left with is that how do you design performance incentives in a way that can address these different types of challenges? And essentially, if we look to theory, three kind of explanations emerge. So one way you can design performance incentives is to base them on objective metrics that are easy to measure and incentivize against. But then the challenge is that you're only capturing measurable dimensions. You're not going to be able to capture the more difficult to measure dimensions. You could rely on subjective metrics to base incentives on, in which supervisors, these middle managers that I spoke about who hold private information, they make evaluations of staff performance and incentives are based on that. You can capture more dimensions through that, but then it can also lead to biases and collusion because these middle managers or supervisors may have their own interests in how they make evaluations. Then you could think about, okay, can we incentivize this supervisor or middle manager to align their incentives with the objectives of the principal so they make more accurate staff evaluations? And then there's a question that, okay, this could work, but how do we do that? So despite all of these different kinds of explanations, there's actually limited evidence on how these play out in governments. So in this paper, we provide experimental evidence on this gap, and essentially we study 3 alternate pay-for-performance schemes for agricultural extension workers in Pakistan. And we do this through a field experiment, which is in collaboration with the Punjab Agriculture Extension Department, in which frontline agents, so I'm going to be using some terminology. So frontline agents in extension, they're called AOs and FAs, agricultural officers and field assistants. So essentially, they were enrolled in 3 different kinds of incentive schemes, and then there was a control group. And what were these schemes? So these closely map onto the 3 different explanations I just showed you. So one was an objective scheme, incentive scheme. In this scheme, the incentives for frontline workers, the AOs and FAs, were based on objective metrics that were captured through a digital platform, a monitoring platform that the department had introduced, which was called the AgriSmart. Then there was the subjective scheme, in which incentives for staff were based on staff evaluations of performance by middle managers. These middle managers are called ADs, assistant directors in this context, who are basically managers at the tehsil level. So they made the evaluations, and staff incentives were based on that. Then we basically worked with the department to introduce another arm, which is the subjective plus arm. This essentially mirrors the subjective arm, with the difference that we introduced a layer of monitoring on the assistant director, the AD. So an aggregated report on the tehsil performance was sent to the AD supervisor. So this is essentially was our light touch way of trying to align the incentives of the supervisor with the objectives of the principal. And then there was a control group. So we basically study these 3 different types of interventions. Our questions. So these, again, are closely linked to the design. So we're interested in 3 questions. The first is, what is the impact of plainly, objective metrics on extension, outreach, and quality? Outreach over here essentially is, these FAs and AOs going out to the field and making village visits, farmer visits, so on and so forth. So it's just outreach effort. And by quality, we mean, more downstream outcomes like farmer knowledge and obviously yield, which is essential in this context. The second question is, we want to know what is the impact of subjective metrics on extension, outreach and quality. And in the third question, we're interested in whether monitoring the supervisor, which we do in Subjective Plus, can enhance the impact of performance incentives based on subjective evaluations. And the idea over here is, so I haven't I don't have time to speak about the theory, but the idea is if we are able to align the supervisor's objectives, incentives with the objectives of the principal, then they might be incentivized to make their complementary inputs into frontline service delivery, as well as make more accurate staff evaluations to make bonuses. So let me just say a little bit about the context before I go on to the results, which I think would be important to understand. So some of you might be thinking, okay, what is the extension department and what does it do? So the main kind of job is to give productivity information to farmers. Punjab has about 5 million farm households, out of which 60% are smallholder farmers. And public extension workers, frontline workers, they're the primary source of productivity information for smallholder farmers. There's a lot of private extension agents in the field as well, but they mostly go to progressive farmers. If we look at reports of yield, they have been lagging in Punjab, but more importantly, there's a difference between progressive and smallholder farmers, which essentially begs the question as to how we can get better information to smallholder farmers and makes this question of trying to incentivize extension agents a bit more effectively. In the department, when we started working, incentives for AOs and FAs were negligible. There was a lot of discussion in the department that I don't have time to get into, but essentially the narrative was that these workers are not doing anything, they don't need any incentive, no work happens in this department, and we don't even know how to incentivize them because there's no monitoring information against which to do that. So there was a desire to have something to incentivize them, but the system was lacking in kind of having the essential monitoring information to do that. There was one incentive, or rather allowance that the staff could get, which was the DA allowance. It's the traveling and daily allowance incentive that staff get, but this was not performance driven. It could only be claimed if they traveled very far distances, like more than 20-kilometer radius out of where they were working. So on paper, the de jure was that you can only do that if you travel those distances, but because there was no incentive, actually this was being given out for all sorts of things. So the discussion with the department was that if we have this budget, can we use this kind of experiment as a way to pilot different incentive schemes and use this budget, the same budget, to make it more performance driven and efficient. And then one thing I want to say is that extension service delivery, we talked about public sector jobs being multidimensional, and extension service delivery is a typical example of that. There's easy to measure and harder to measure dimensions. You can measure whether an FA or AO are going to the field, they're visiting villages or farmers. It's very difficult to know what the quality of advice is. But the ADs at the tehsil level, they're working with 8 to 9 FAs and AOs, so they know, they speak to the farmers in the area, they know what their AOs and FAs are like, so they hold more private information. So this is a setting where studying these research questions becomes relevant. One final piece about the context is that prior to the rollout, I just mentioned that there was no information against which you could actually incentivize these workers. So we worked with the department to design and roll out the AgriSmart program. And this essentially had two components. One was a smartphone-based monitoring system through which staff reported their daily time use. So this was things like villages visited, farmer training programs completed, number of farmers reached, so on and so forth. Farmer training programs were quite critical because this is the main activity that AOs and FAs do for any season, whether it's harvesting or sowing. They gather farmers together and they give them essential information before every season. So the smartphone application for the first time started recording staff time use. And the objective arm incentives were based on indicators in that. But then the interesting thing was that there was also an accompanying dashboard where the middle managers and ADs could make their key managerial inputs. And one of those was scheduling and assigning farmer training programs to their staff. So before this, there was no way or no record of what the ADs were doing, who they were assigning these trainings to, and so on. This is the final piece, just so we know what time period we're talking about. So this started sometime around April 2018, and we finished kind of the program in 2021, and there were a bunch of programmatic things that happened in the middle as well. So I'm going to now go on to the results, and I'm going to show you 4 key findings, and then some thoughts we have on what explains these. So the first thing that we find is that all treatments, they improve extension outreach with the highest treatment effects in the objective arm. So what you're seeing over here, I can't really walk around, or maybe, am I still audible? Okay, so what you're seeing over here is an AgriSmart performance index, which essentially includes different measures of outreach. So things like days worked, hours worked, farmers visited, villages visited. So you can see, and this is normalized. So you can see that the effects are the strongest in the objective, but they're also significant in the subjective and subjective plus. These effects in the objective arm are significantly different from the subjective and subjective plus arm. So this is intuitive, right? Because in the objective arm, we had explicitly linked the incentives to these indicators. We also specifically look at the number of farmer training programs completed, and we look at this separately because this could only be computed for staff against whom ADs had actually scheduled a training program. So over here, what we see is that there's only significant effects in the subjective plus arm, and this is significantly different from the subjective and objective arm. So in the subjective plus arm, staff are completing close to 2 more FTPs every month compared to the other arms, which is essentially means, more visiting close to 2 unique villages and up to 40 to 50 more farmers. The second thing that we find is, next we look at farmer outcomes. I mentioned this briefly. We look at basically farmer access to extension as well as quality of extension through yield. And when we look at farmer outcomes, we're actually only seeing these effects kind of drill down to the farmers, downstream effects in the subjective and subjective plus. And the impacts are particularly pronounced for marginalized farmers in the subjective plus arm. I'm sorry if you can't see this very clearly, but over here, what you're seeing is the full sample and the marginalized farmers. This is an index which is measuring farmer access to extension. In the subjective and subjective plus, these effects are significant. In comparison to the control group, it increases access by about 8 percentage points. For marginalized farmers, the impacts in the subjective arm basically are only significant at the 10% level, about a 7% increase over the control group, and this is about a 10% increase over the control group and significant at the 1% level. For the marginalized farmers, the effects are also significantly different from the objective arm, but not from the subjective arm. So you must be wondering that you just showed us that extension outreach improved for the objective arm the most, and it also improved for the other arms. So why are we not seeing these effects when we look at downstream outcomes at the farmer level in the objective arm? And you also might be thinking, why are the effects more pronounced in the subjective plus arm? And essentially, what we're observing is that different treatments are encouraging different types of efforts. And there are kind of papers which show theoretical kind of discussions why this might happen. So in the objective arm, it's encouraging more effort on the intensive margin. They tend to go to farmers, but they also repeat the same farmer more so. So you can imagine that they're expanding access to an existing database, the existing client base of farmers more so than the subjective plus arm. In the subjective plus arm, on the other hand, we're seeing that they also go to, repeated farmers more, but they're also going to more unique farmers and more unique villages. So this is essentially makes the point that I just explained. But the key point over here is, if you just ignore the chart for a second, that in the subjective plus arm, we're seeing more effort on the extensive margin, reaching out to more farmers and going to more villages. But this is specifically for conducting more farmer training programs. And remember, I mentioned that this is a key activity where you're bringing a lot of farmers together and giving them more information. So there's something about how they're doing more FTPs and more unique villages and getting more unique farmers, which appears to be driving the results. And the final point is that why is subjective plus able to improve effort for FTPs? What is it about this arm? So remember, in the subjective plus arm, we had a layer on the AD, the supervisor, where reports about the ADs were going to the AD supervisor. So we can actually look at what is it that the AD was doing differently. And we actually see when we look at AD's task completion, some of their key managerial tasks, such as whether they're scheduling more farmer training programs for their staff, whether they're approving and scheduling more leaves for their staff. What we see is that it is indeed the case that ADs in subjective plus, they are scheduling more farmer training programs for their staff. And this is perhaps being driven by their reports, which were going to their supervisors, which had clear indicators about whether they were actually doing the managerial tasks they were supposed to do. I don't have time to go into this, but there's obviously a lot of questions about what is it that the ADs in subjective plus were doing differently. Were they also monitoring more? Were they assigning bonuses differently? Because that's a key point, right? And we have quite a lot of data on bonus assignments for every month, and we also have staff characteristics. So we're able to predict what, actually, how are the ADs assigning bonuses in the subjective and subjective plus arm. And because in the subjective plus arm, we had this monitoring layer, what we're seeing is that in that arm, ADs are more likely than the subjective ADs to base bonus allocations on farmer training programs completed, and they're also using personality of staff, such as their pro-social motivation and their personality type that is predictive of bonus allocations. So this is essentially implying that they're using their private information in some way to make bonus assignments. So I'm not going to go into the summary, but the main kind of conclusion and policy implications that I want to end with is that this study essentially highlights, the criticality of middle managers in the design of incentive schemes. A lot of the literature that we've seen on performance incentives tends to focus on frontline workers. And that's possibly because it's easier to incentivize them, and they are the most important workforce. But we also need to think about middle managers, because in many service delivery departments, they make complementary inputs into frontline service delivery. There's a lot of examples of, those people in the room who work on education, the kinds of things that district officers do in the context of education service delivery. So thinking about how to include them in the design of incentive schemes is important. And then the second thing is that for the extension department that actually wanted to go ahead and implement an incentive scheme, there are important trade-offs to consider. And the important question is also to ask, is there even a trade-off? So, for example, the objective arm, it improves outreach, extension outreach. It has no negative effects on quality. It didn't negatively affect yield, but it is more cost effective. It costs half as much as the subjective arm, but it only gets 50% of the TADA budget to the frontline workers, whereas the department wanted 70% to go to frontline workers. So how do they assign different costs and benefits to these different things? On the other hand, the subjective plus, it improves outreach and downstream outcomes, but it is more expensive. So essentially, when we're considering trade-offs, or the department is considering trade-offs, it's basically about the costs and benefits that they're assigning to these different outcomes, and also do things like inclusion, because remember, we saw effects in subjective plus on marginalized farmers as well. I'm going to stop here, but generally this research is relevant for the Agricultural Extension Department, who were the main kind of collaborator, but also for policymakers in low middle income countries who are working with frontline service delivery departments, where middle managers play an important part in frontline service delivery. I'm going to end here and invite Bakhtawar for comments, and then open the floor for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting paper. It was a really good read. So, and I think you address a very important question. And these inefficiencies in the public sector service deliveries are very critical and important. And incentives, of course, play a key role in addressing these. So just to quickly summarize the paper, so this is an experiment done with the Agriculture Department in Punjab across 126 tehsils. So they have 3 treatment arms, where the first treatment arm is mirroring mirroring objectives through this Agri-Smart app, and the second treatment arm is a subjective supervisor discretion-based incentive. And the third one is the second treatment, where the supervisor has the discretion of this incentive, but then you monitor the supervisor from the higher ups. And the key findings are that the objective arm does improve outcomes that were measurable, right, through the app, but the subjective plus arms enhances extension quality, and especially on for the marginalized farmers. So I just have a few comments about the paper. The first, and I think my burning question when I was going through this paper was, why should the supervisor change their behavior? Why should they do more these okay, sure, we are giving their higher ups some information about how they're performing, but are they incentivized to change their behavior, or are they going to be fired? Because from what I understand, this might be problematic. They will be reassigned. So what might happen, like, once these supervisors, okay, they change their behavior, we understand that, but why should they change their behavior? And second thing is, we know that they schedule more FTPs, but why would these FTPs lead to increase in farming yields? You give a farmer training program. Are the farmings learning more? Who are the people who are attending these? And why would they change their practices or farming practices? Or is it something else? Sorry. Why would so? And the other thing is the data from the farmers that we have collected is through feedback surveys over the phone. Maybe address that if there is some self-reported bias. And second, I think it is important to address the COVID-19 disruptions, because there was some a pause in the experiment, and how COVID impacted agriculture practices for the farmers, and also to partially address some attrition from the start of the program to the end of the program. And second, the farmer registration exercise that was also happening simultaneously. That was also probably done by the same agriculture offices and the FAs, the farmer registration. during that time. So yeah, so maybe their activities were kind of divided, and how they would, if that was also part of their the outcome. And uh, the last part is essentially about uh, the link of the how the behavior of the top management would change the agriculture outcomes of the farmer. So I guess some suggestions for this was that you know maybe we do a subsample of these marginalized farmers with progressive farmers, because progressive farmers are some people that are uh, that more of these FAs and AOs reached, and also do a balance test for attrition, and also check if the feedback that was given by the farmers has kind of do a heterogeneity analysis. And the final suggestion for this paper for me is linking it with other global challenges like climate resilience and food securities, and also discuss a little bit more about the how externally valid these settings are, and who else could benefit from these results. And just final thought, I think this is a very interesting paper, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? And then I can take one round.
Zahra, for a fascinating paper. I think sort of the first point that Ali Bakhtawar made, I think there's a deeper question here. What I couldn't figure out is, in the subjective and subjective plus, are you varying metrics, or are you varying the intensity of monitoring?
Okay.
And that sort of I struggle with, because in a clean experiment, I think what you want to vary is the metrics, right? So you started off by saying that there's some objective dimensions to metrics and subjective dimensions. It's like, I can treat some metrics, but I can't sort of observe the amount of effort somebody's making in designing a curriculum. But if the monitoring incentive changes, then it could be that that's where the effect is coming from. But then these are very differently designed incentive schemes. So I think some clarity about, and the other thing which I sort of couldn't get is when you're looking at outcomes, farmer quality outcomes, what's the outcome? I mean, is it actual yields, or and are they tied to the people who were given extension farms? So some clarity on that would help sort of provide feedback.
Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. I had a question that's more of kind of a future research direction, because this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, but wasn't able to do. There's another misallocation mechanism where there's such a heterogeneity in yields, and pest attacks are so random and things like that, that sometimes extension workers go into farms that may not be the ones that need help the most. And so I think there's a really interesting angle around maybe using technology with satellite data where extension workers have more visibility, or even middle management has more visibility into kind of which farmers, kind of a ground level view of productivity or issues that arise more on the issue side. And I've looked at it in a different context, and really if a pest comes or something like that, you really can see the heat map of that farm going down. So since you already have a relationship with the Ag Extension Department, I think this could be a really interesting idea for future research.
Okay. I can. Oh, there's a question there.
Thanks so much, Zara. Really interesting work, as you know. I just had one thought. I mean, I completely agree with you that most of the research is actually on frontline workers, and I applaud you for going on to the middle manager issue in public sector. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this area. But of course, working with frontline workers, one of the reasons why we do that is because, I mean, essentially that's like that's where the light is when you're looking for the keys, right? Because they're just doing one thing. We can measure their output a lot more easily. Whereas with middle managers, you very quickly run up against this multi-effort issue. And so one model of the public sector worker is I'm a guy who's just sitting around doing nothing, and then I get this incentive, and now I do this thing that you incentivized. The other thing is I'm doing lots of things. Some, like you said, some you can measure, some you can't, some you can incentivize, some you can't. And then you incentivize one thing, and then I start doing more of that and less of the others. And I think one of the things that's particularly interesting in your study, in your context, is if there's a way that you can start to speak to where the effort is moving away from. If it is from leisure, that's fine, that's great, but that's just an assumption. So if we can start to catalog that, right, even if it's qualitative work, just to kind of show the mechanism through which effort is shifting, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I guess we can. Okay, yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I was just in your topic, experiment evidence for agriculture extension in Pakistan. Whereas in your presentation, only Punjab Agriculture Department has been mentioned. There are other provinces as well, KPK, Sindh, Balochistan. Yeah. Then why these are missing? You can't replicate. This is not representing all Pakistan. It's representing only Punjab. Then how you can replicate in all over the Pakistan?
Thank you for your comment.
Because I am from a greater department, so I'm asking you this question.
No, thank you everyone for your comments. Really thought-provoking. I'm going to try to respond to most of them. So I think I'm going to respond to your first point, which was basically about the ADs, and also try to address Ali's question simultaneously. So the design in the subjective arm, there were no metrics really. The supervisor, the ADs, they had complete discretion and they could assign staff incentives based on their own assessment of how well they were doing. In Subjective Plus, we don't change that. The ADs still have complete discretion. The only difference in Subjective Plus is that we introduced a layer of monitoring on the AD, which basically involved sending a tehsil level report to the AD supervisors. Now, the question is, what kind of indicators were there in that report? And were they very objective, or did we kind of take away from the sense of, one being an arm that was completely discretionary and one not so much? So in terms of the indicators, they were mostly based on what the AD was supposed to do. So the AD's managerial tasks. So in that sense, the way we're looking at these arms is that in the subjective and subjective plus, the metrics are not changing. The only difference is this layer of monitoring on the assistant director. On your point as to why is it that the ADs were scheduling more farmer training programs, I didn't have time to kind of include all of those details, but in the tehsil report, we had 3 to 4 indicators. I should have had an image of it. And one of those was basically the number of staff against which they had scheduled an FTP. So they knew very clearly that this is something that is going to their supervisors. In our end-line survey, we asked ADs in this arm a bunch of questions. Do you think these reports are important? Why do you think they're important? Nearly 70% of them said that we think these reports might feed into our promotion. We know promotion is based on seniority, but there was some sense that their seniors could maybe, file these things about them somewhere. Also, 30% of them, 40% of them said that we think our supervisors will take action based on these reports. So it's not like these reports were just being sent, they were doing something, and we have that information from our end-line survey. On the other stuff, so in the paper, I did send you my extended abstract, about which I apologize, not the full paper. But in the full paper, we have a lot of analysis on nutrition, and we do a bunch of balance tests, and everything is balanced. So I think that's not a concern for us. In terms of the yield measure, and we're still trying to think how to best capture that. So essentially, what we had was we wanted to survey farmers that were completely external to what the FAs and AOs were documenting in the app. because we did not want this issue of self-reporting from the same farmers who are being recorded on the system. So at the point when we were doing the survey, the extension department had done a huge farmer registration exercise in which they had gathered data of about 3 million farmers. So we mapped those external farmers to each of our workers, and in the surveys what we're doing is we're randomly selecting one random farmer from this database against each worker, and then we survey them in 8 different rounds. So these farmers who were registered by the extension department, they are farmers who receive services from the extension department, and they're also completely external. There's no reporting bias in that sense that these are the same farmers from the kind of, from the app. In terms of why we think the yield, that yield is improving in subjective plus, is because so I mentioned this briefly, that in the subjective plus arm, because the ADs are scheduling FTPs for more staff, they're also doing them in more unique villages, and they're getting more unique farmers. We have farmer phone numbers in our database, so we can actually show you whether, farmers are, how many unique farmers are being reached. So we think the effect on yield is being driven by that. We don't have a lot of detailed information on farmer practices. Our phone survey was pretty brief, but we do have some, we did construct farmer knowledge questions, and we don't see improvements in that. We're just picking up this improvement in yield. So we can't really show the exact mechanism. But what I will say on this is that the improvement that we see is about 7 to 8 percentage points over the control group. And when I was looking at other information, and this is an information kind of, mechanism through which extension agents are doing delivery. If you look at other information, extension information interventions, which are targeted towards specific varieties or specific kind of, fertilizers, the effects can be quite large. So the effects are not that large, but for us it was still interesting and exciting because the extension department has not yet updated the information that the agents deliver to farmers. The information is quite outdated, as my colleague over here might know. So these effects are coming despite that, which I guess are based on just more effort. On the final point, I completely understand there are differences across provinces due to constraints of making sustainable partnerships and securing enough funding. We weren't able to do this everywhere, but I hope we can study in other provinces as well. Thank you. I'm going to end here. I think we're over time. Thank you for listening, and thank you for this session.